So what's keeping you awake tonight? In the last 50 years, the genre of martial arts cinema has exploded from a relative cottage industry born out of Japan and China into a multi-million-dollar global machine. Throughout the 1960s, only 8 officially recognized martial arts films were produced. Beginning in 1970, however, that number would rise to close to 100. It would continue to rise through both the 1980s and the 1990s before tapering off at the turn of the millennium. And the catalyst for that explosion can be traced back to one man: Bruce Lee. But in the 45 years since his tragic death in 1973, audiences, directors, and movie moguls have been looking everywhere for the next Bruce Lee and failed. Why is that? What was it about a man who stood all of 5'7" and weighed barely 150 pounds that made him so different than those who came before or after, and also so irreplaceable? Well, first, consider the landscape of both Asian cinema and action cinema before Bruce Lee arrived on the scene. In post-war China, the focus was on developing what's become known as the wuxia style of story, heroic tales taken from Chinese fantasy literature and used in sprawling epics like Dragon Gate Inn. And while the genre became a staple of their film industry, it took nearly 4 decades for a wuxia film to gain massive appeal in America. Meanwhile, in Japan, director Akira Kurosawa had spent most of the 1950s transforming cinema with his samurai epics, including Rashomon, Yojimbo, and most notably, Seven Samurai. It's noteworthy that his directorial debut came with 1943's Sanshiro Sagata, about the creation of the martial art Judo, but Kurosawa didn't begin to hit his stride as a director until after World War II, when he began his long association with actor Toshiro Mifune. What Kurosawa and Mifune would lay the groundwork for was a new genre called Chanbara, meaning sword-fighting movies. While Kurosawa's samurai epics had plenty of action driving their stories, their stature as cinematic landmarks tend to keep them from being name-checked as great martial arts films as well. So it was into this void that Bruce Lee entered as a 30-year-old martial arts teacher and former Hong Kong child film star. Having tried and failed to break into American TV as Kato on The Green Hornet, and disillusioned with the stereotyping and whitewashing of Asian characters in Hollywood, Lee returned to Hong Kong in 1971. He would only make 4 films over the final 3 years of his life, with a 5th, Game of Death, in production. But they forever changed both how the martial arts were perceived around the world, and how action movies were created. Unlike the heroes of wuxia or samurai films, Bruce Lee never portrayed someone who gave the impression of being a superhero or part of the social elite. The template was just a common man responding to the acts of an antagonist. This gave audiences a relatability to Bruce that wasn't necessarily available to Mifune or the great wuxia actors of the time. Because Bruce played someone willing to fight back against an enemy, it allowed his films to explore the nature of antagonism in different ways. For example, in The Big Boss, it was a corrupt businessman in Thailand. In Fist of Fury, it's the Japanese occupiers who murdered his teacher. Way of the Dragon, the Italian mafia in Rome and the American they hired to stop him. Game of Death, the gang who kidnapped his family. And in Enter the Dragon, the man who betrayed his way of life.
You have offended my family, and you have offended the Shaolin Temple.
The lack of one-dimensional cookie-cutter megalomaniacs grounded Bruce's films by allowing him to confront things he was personally invested in, like the stereotyping of the Chinese by other Asians and people abroad.
Because you see, I have already made up my mind that in the United States, I think something about the Oriental, the true Oriental should be shown.
Hollywood sure as heck hasn't.
You better believe it, man. I mean, it's always that pigtail and bouncing around, chop, with the eyes slant and all that.
As someone who challenged the Hollywood status quo regarding the whitewashing of Asians by non-Asian actors through the late 60s, his status as a heroic figure was boosted by another quality that set him apart from other action stars of the era. Bruce Lee was a physical specimen, and that physicality translated to a genre looking for a dynamic leading man. To that point, American action stars fit the more rugged template of the post-war era. While actors like Marlon Brando, Charles Bronson, Steve McQueen, and Clint Eastwood went on to set the tone for how Hollywood cultivated their leading men for the next decade, no one had ever seen an actor who looked like Bruce. That again allowed him to buck the racial stereotypes of the day and bring a new element to the martial arts genre that, like it or not, helped give it more widespread attention. Sex appeal. If you trace the lineage of action stars post-Bruce Lee, you could make the argument that everyone from Arnold Schwarzenegger, Sylvester Stallone, and Jean-Claude Van Damme all tried to duplicate his physical archetype. Along with that raw physicality, though, Bruce had the innate ability to convey both style and emotional depth with seemingly very little effort. When he kills Han's right-hand man O'Hara in Enter the Dragon, the kaleidoscope of emotion on Bruce's face is something I haven't seen many actors display before or since. The ability to shift on an emotional dime from rage to grief to fear isn't easy, yet he manages to do so in a way that feels organic to the audience because it's in line with his philosophy of knowing yourself well enough to honestly express the moment.
To me, okay, to me, ultimately, martial art means honestly expressing yourself. Now, it is very difficult to do. I mean, it is easy for me to put on a show and be cocky and be flooded with a cocky feeling and then feel like pretty cool and all that. Or I can make all kinds of phony things, you see what I mean? Blinded by it. Or I can show you some really fancy movement. But to express oneself honestly, not lying to oneself, and to express myself honestly, now that, my friend, is very hard to do, and you have to train.
For all his great skill as an actor, Toshiro Mifune was neither a samurai nor a martial artist. The early wuxia films cast actors who had some degree of martial arts acumen, but that was a byproduct of the centuries-old traditions of Chinese opera, where those filmmakers took their cues. But from the age of 13, Bruce Lee was a legitimate martial artist. First in his studies with Kung Fu master Yip Man, then on his own as the creator of his own style, Jeet Kune Do. Bruce was also a proficient writer, and after trouble with director Lo Wei on his first two films, he convinced producer Raymond Chow to let him write, produce, and direct Way of the Dragon. The ability to establish full creative control of a film would later become a template utilized by the likes of Jackie Chan, Sammo Hung, Donnie Yen, and more. Now, you only have to watch one scene to truly understand how much Bruce Lee changed how martial arts films were made. Enter the Dragon's fight with the guards. In about 5 minutes, he dispatches 52 men in a variety of ways, and while none of them have the flamboyancy or elegance of other well-known martial arts actors, what's definitely not lacking is the perception of lethality. The primary thesis of Jeet Kune Do is to end combat in the most efficient way possible, and in developing his art, Bruce recognized the ultimate expression of defeating an opponent is to do so with one devastating strike. As a result, every time Bruce hits someone, it looks like it hurts. A lot. It also gave him a more animalistic persona as he dispatches his opponents with primal ferocity, highlighted by his trademark scream. That said, his characters were never invincible. They could be hit, knocked down, or cut, meaning Bruce would have to adapt in order to win, and that adaptation to an opponent was another key tenet of Jeet Kune Do. The combination of technical proficiency, kinetic power, and unbelievable speed make his films utterly captivating, and they laid the groundwork for everyone and everything that has come after. If there's one aspect of Bruce's legacy that hasn't been appreciated enough, it's that he created the model for shooting aggressive fight scenes. Using a steady, wide-angle scope, the camera captures Bruce's choreography in a way that highlighted both the artistry and actual combat. Now, in modern action films especially, the tendency is to film a fight by jumping back and forth between different angles in rapid succession. This gives the illusion that the actors are fully involved in the choreography as opposed to stunt performers, but it also dilutes the overall effect. Because while it conveys a certain degree of power, there's no real indication of one fighter making contact with another. In the climactic fight of Way of the Dragon, Bruce Lee and Chuck Norris square off in the Roman Colosseum. And for years, rumors circulated that the two men actually traded blows with one another as cameras rolled, and a lot of that has to do with how the fight was shot. Sadly, as action films continue to evolve, directors and choreographers seem to be moving further away from this approach. Which makes me wonder if Bruce were still alive today, would this still be the norm? I think the fundamental reason why we haven't been able to find the next Bruce Lee is because the entire genre of martial arts films as we know it started with Bruce Lee, and a genre is never created at the time. It only manifests itself when others follow in the wake of whoever created it. Over the last half century, there have been many who've tried to fill the void left by Bruce's death. Some took the genre in new directions, while others chose to reinvent or refine it. As a result, we've seen a much wider spectrum of martial arts films than ever before. From this, to this, to this. To this. To this. To this. And yes, even to this.
您找。
In the end, I think maybe rather than trying to recreate Bruce, it might be better to follow one of his more fundamental concepts
I
instead.
said, empty your mind. Be formless, shapeless, like water. Now you put water into a cup, it becomes the cup. You put water into a bottle, it becomes the bottle. You put it in a teapot, it becomes the teapot. Now water can flow, or it can crash. Be water, my friend. Like that, you see?
No, I see. I get the idea.
Uh-huh.
I get the...
Bruce Lee said the key to immortality is to live a life worth remembering. And he attained that immortality by doing what so many of us struggle to do every day. He honestly expressed himself. Now go get some sleep. And sweet dreams when you get there.